Hello. I'm Molly Meacher, prospector here, and about 8 years ago, somebody asked me if I would establish an all-party parliamentary group for drug policy reform, and the next point was, oh, and you can be chairman. So that's the history in brief. I'm now co-chair with a Conservative MP and a Labour MP, which is very helpful. But in the early days, I realised that the UN conventions, starting, of course, with the 1961 convention, followed by two later ones, was dominating not only global drug policy, but also, in that context, UK drug policy. It was going to be very, very difficult to get any shift in UK drug policy while the UN conventions were interpreted as requiring every country, every member state all over the world to have a prohibitionist policy. Everything must be prohibited, whether you deal, whether you use, whether you grow, whether you supply, whatever it is. You are prohibited and you must be punished. And I thought, oh, goodness me, clearly this is wrong, but where do we start? And for, I would say, 5 years anyway, 5, 6 years, we worked very, very hard on the international stage, really, working with presidents of Latin American countries, most particularly Guatemala, Mexico and Colombia, and they say that it was because of the work we were doing with them that those three presidents, starting with the Guatemalan president, demanded a new global drug policy, and the three of them went to the UN and demanded the UN do something about it. And as a result of those three presidents' initiative, at the UN, the United Nations General Assembly's special session on drug policy occurred in April 2016. And most people, most NGOs, I think I ought to say at the time, were very disappointed because there was no commission established at that on gas to look at the UN conventions. My position had been, and the APPG position had been, that it was a waste of time putting energy into any idea of reforming the UN conventions. China and Russia will not even allow one word of some supplementary document to be changed, like and to but. Object, and that's that. Wouldn't happen. So the idea that UN conventions could be changed was, to me, crazy. Anyway, so I worked, in fact, with Barack Obama's White House people, the Latin Americans, the EU Commission, vitally UNODC, who else, ECOSOC, all sorts of people crucial in the global drug policy world. And thank you, Barack Obama. In my view, we would not have got what we did get at that UNGAS without Barack Obama having been in that position, obviously President of the US, at that time. And what we did get was a complete flip within the UN itself, a statement from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, that instead of prohibition, evidence-based public health policy is here to stay. Those words will not leave me. I mean, they are so important. Every member state can use those words. Every member state needs to look at the evidence about what drug policies work. That takes you back to, well, what's the objectives of drug policy? Maybe it's to put as many people in prison as you want to. No, I don't think so. So the next step is clarifying objectives. And if I stick maybe at the moment with the demand side, the objectives surely are reducing addiction and reducing harm associated with drugs. And of course, the assumption behind that is that young people, and maybe everybody actually, has always and will always use drugs. I'm addicted to chocolate. Okay, somebody else may be addicted to alcohol, tobacco, whatever it is. And it is completely arbitrary that certain drugs are illegal, controlled, and prohibited and give rise to punishment. If we went for the most dangerous drugs, then anyone smoking a cigarette or taking a glass of wine would be put in prison, and those taking cannabis would be fined. No one would interfere with that. So we began. So we managed, and obviously we're tiny players. But I did feel I was working with the right people, at least we were, at the global level, to enable us now, then, should I say, in 2016, to move on to the UK. And the first priority for us was surely the rescheduling of cannabis for medical use. And so the last 2 years, we have done what we could, had an inquiry, published a couple of reports on all the evidence to support the rescheduling of cannabis and the prescription of cannabis to people with a range of conditions. And we had Professor Mike Barnes very kindly agreed to write a report for the APPG looking at the evidence of the efficacy of medical cannabis for a range of conditions. And if I've remembered it right, the conditions for which he argues there is good evidence of efficacy, with 2 random controlled trials, other evidence, and all the rest of it, are neuropathic pain, seizures and multiple sclerosis, the consequences of chemotherapy, nausea, sleeplessness, and so on, and I think the fourth one's anxiety. Interestingly, epilepsy was not one that he believed there was sufficient evidence to justify rescheduling. Okay, so for 2 years we battle on, achieved nothing really very much at all, other than debates, discussion. And then, of course, along come the 2 little boys. And for 6 months, I think it's true to say, we worked with Alfie Dingley's family, with End Our Pain. Peter Carroll has been an absolute wonder. Introducing that family to the media, to MPs, to ministers, to the Prime Minister indeed, Theresa May, when we had a run by End Our Pain. We were working closely together, but they did the work, to be honest. When we had a petition for Alfie to be able to bring in his cannabis from the Netherlands, Theresa May did meet Alfie and his parents. Maybe I shouldn't mention it, but despite that, she still argued against rescheduling cannabis when the Cabinet discussed it. But Sajid Javid won the day, so thank you, Sajid Javid, very much indeed. So we owe a huge debt to Hannah Dingley, and thank you, little Alfie, and also Billy Caldwell and his mother, because it became an embarrassment for the government to stand in the way of rescheduling cannabis and enabling this child, Alfie, well, both of them, to bring in their cannabis. As people may remember, Billy Caldwell's mother had had his cannabis confiscated. He'd been living on cannabis from America for years, and that child would just die very quickly in the absence of his medicine. Alfie Dingley, different story, as many of you will remember. He was having 3,000 seizures a year on UK prescribed medication, which his consultant agreed would create psychosis, would damage his organs, and would ultimately kill him. Consultant therefore agrees that Mum should take little Alfie to the Netherlands, which she did, and to cut a long story short, cannabis medicines were carefully developed for Alfie, which reduced his seizure rate from 3,000 seizures a year, grand mal, down to an average annual rate of 20, and I think all or almost all petit mal, which is, anybody who knows anything about epilepsy, is a completely different issue altogether, just a minor stop in one's brain activity. So when he was not allowed by the Home Office to bring in his medicine, that was when the campaign really started. And the media, of course, were wonderful. Home Office officials, you'd really think this family was trying to bring in an atom bomb. You really would. The extraordinary lengths that they required that family to go to, and the spending of £20,000 on 3 different licenses for a pharmacist, for a doctor, and for, I don't know, the family, I think it was, utterly ridiculous. And yet they could not find a way of being more flexible. And Professor Mike Barnes is a saint. He did all the work to get those 3 licenses for that family, and they were just about to get the license when then Billy came out of the woodwork, Billy Caldwell, and the threat of that child's death got the Home Office immediately to declare rescheduling. So if anyone is trying to change policy in any very sensitive, difficult area, You need a very good human story, and it's got to become embarrassing to a government not to change if you really want some change there. So that's the medical cannabis story. But of course, the change, the reform is going to be much more narrow than it should be, mainly because the MHRA, the Medicines Regulatory Authority, require very rigorous standards in terms of research, the numbers of random controlled trials, the double blind, the size of the sample and all the rest of it. And because of the illegality of cannabis, there is less research. I'm not saying there isn't any research. There is a lot of research actually into the benefits of cannabis. But as I see it, it's very unlikely that people are going to be able to get cannabis prescribed legally for more than a very few conditions. And also, even for those conditions, the cannabis medicines are likely to be specials, unlicensed, and therefore only prescribable as a last resort, which is terribly unhelpful and damaging for very sick people. And we know that apart from the 4 conditions I've mentioned, there are many others. People with Crohn's disease, Parkinson's, all sorts of things benefit from cannabis. So that brings me on to the issue of the legalisation of cannabis for recreational use, because of course, if in fact it's not illegal to have cannabis for recreational use, then you could import a really good medicine from the Netherlands, even if it wasn't licensed here, and you could take it, or Columbia Care or another company could bring in medicines, and people could readily get hold of them, even if they were not prescribed and licensed. Albeit there is then an issue of price, and there's an issue of inequality, rich people, poor people, and all the rest of it. But it's trying to think, about steps forward. But the medical side of recreational cannabis is, of course, only one aspect. The big argument for legalising cannabis for recreational use is that the cannabis available on the streets is, I would say, it's dangerous. I think 100% THC, which is the active ingredient, or 95% THC, is very bad for people. It's not what you want, and certainly sick people. We think that maybe even 1 million people use cannabis for all sorts of medical reasons. All they can get hold of is scum, but they, of course, be much safer if they had something else. And of course, the other side is that young people will always use drugs. And at the moment, we've got the psychoactive substances that people bring in from China. The possession and use of those drugs is legal. The possession and use of cannabis and ecstasy and so on are illegal. So what do young people do? They go on the net and they get dangerous, potentially dangerous, unknown substances off the web, instead of going down to the web and getting some legal, carefully labelled, carefully balanced, safe, I would say safe, cannabis. So for me, it's a no-brainer, really. I think people should be able to have cannabis safely and properly labelled, with all the warnings and educational campaigns about the tiny number of people with a psychotic propensity, and they need that, otherwise they won't have a problem. If a young person has a propensity to psychosis, they shouldn't take cannabis, and there should be a warning on the package. And of course, if it was legal, there would be a warning on the package for people with a family history of psychosis, or maybe they're in the early stages of psychotic illness. But the other side of that, in relation to psychosis, which is very, very important to me, CBD is an antipsychotic. And there is research now going on in Israel to look at CBD as a treatment for psychosis, and that's one of the main ingredients of cannabis. If it's CBD alone, it may be the best thing you can take, actually. And a mixture of CBD and some psychological therapies, for me, if that could be a replacement of the horrendous antipsychotic medications that people have to take at the moment, that would be a massive step forward. So the more liberalisation of this cannabis plant, the better, in my view, for all sorts of reasons. But the scare stories about psychosis, there is another side. CBD is an antipsychotic. In a lot of people's view. So, you know, cannabis is one thing. Then you can move on to ecstasy. People don't generally, almost nobody dies of ecstasy. People die having taken an ecstasy pill because the pill has been adulterated, or because the pill is ridiculously strong and the young person didn't know how strong it was. Or the young person didn't drink any water, and one of the things you have to do is drink water. If ecstasy were legalised, it would be infinitely safer, and I would say almost safe. I don't think I dare say completely safe, somebody coming at me. But it should be legalised, in my view, regulated, to make sure it is clean, unadulterated, of not too great strength, very well labelled, side effects on the package and all the rest of it, and an education campaign. So, you know, one can move quite a way along this road of drug policy reform. Personally, I would have heroin treatment clinics along the lines of Switzerland. This legalises and regulates heroin for heroin addicts, not for Joe Bloggs in the street, but if you're a heroin addict, the Swiss have shown with a good consumption room, a heroin treatment clinic, a methadone treatment clinic, they can get 2/3 of heroin addicts completely off drugs within 18 months, and each one of those heroin addicts on average, they say, was committing 80 crimes a month. So think of the impact on the community. Massive drop in crime, and these people whose lives were utterly and completely destroyed, you know, being able to pick up their kids from having been in care, take them home and look after them as a perfectly, you know, well-functioning human being, go and get a job, and all the rest of it that we know about. So heroin treatment in Switzerland is expensive, but it's highly cost-effective. For every franc they spend, they save 2. The government saves 2. So another no-brainer, in my view. I mean, there are other drugs where I don't know what the solutions are, but that needs working on. But if we dealt with cannabis, ecstasy and heroin, my goodness me, took all of that out of the illegal market and enabled young people to have a much safer life in relation to those drugs, maybe the issue of the online drugs from China would diminish massively, and maybe cocaine too. I wouldn't be sure. But you know, clearly one of the worst aspects of the prohibitionist regime under the UN Convention of 1961, which is still in place, is that the criminal gangs, the terrorists indeed, are making, we understand, something like they have a trade of 350 billion or so in drugs, which of course feeds all their activities. And also that in the supply countries, the level of corruption is absolutely massive. Governments are almost brought to their knees, really dysfunctional in some of those Central American countries because of the drugs trade. As we know, Colombia, President Santos has done a wonderful job trying to deal with that, but huge difficulty and certainly long story yet to come. And the level of violence, and tens of thousands of people have lost their lives in Central America because of the drugs war. And I have to say, until I went to those countries, I thought the war on drugs was a sort of euphemism. No, it's not. Police being trained to use submachine guns and the rest of it to fight the drug barons, and there is a genuine war going on out there. The violence level is extremely high. So there are terrible, terrible consequences for those countries. And over here, well, there's just huge crime on the back of the drugs trade. So what do? I think, personally, having got the door open on medical cannabis, people might have got the politicians thinking about, well, have we got the rest right? Have we got this one so wrong? And probably the most useful way forward would be to have an independent commission looking at the prohibitionist regime versus evidence-based public health policy now recommended by the United Nations. I think that's the way we should go.